A study published Monday, August 30, by the National Bureau of Economic Research finds that new ideas in biomedical research are less likely to spread when they are generated by women and minorities than when generated by men. The authors of the study, which was not peer-reviewed, used a computational technique called natural language processing to scan titles and abstracts in MEDLINE for novel 1, 2, or 3-word phrases originating in biomedical research papers published between 1980 and 2008. The researchers ranked these phrases by the total number of mentions they received in the year when they first appeared and analyzed the top 0.1% of phrases for each year to assess whether each represented an actual new idea or scientific innovation. We tracked specific ideas by using the information in the title and abstract in the biomedical literature, so that we know which specific idea travels from one scientist to another scientist, from one location to another location, says coauthor Wei Cheng, an economist at East China University of. After homing in on a list of top innovations, which included developments such as polymerase chain reaction and HIV/AIDS, Cheng and her former PhD advisor, Ohio State University economist Bruce Weinberg, analyzed the social networks of the authors of the papers to coin the innovative phrases, see. From this, they determined a pool of potential adopters of the new idea. People who had published in similar areas or who had similar medical subject headings, terms in their publications. They then calculated how the likelihood of a potential adopter picking up the idea related to factors such as their network distance to the innovator, and on the innovator's race or gender. Ideas generated by teams of mostly male innovators were mentioned just over 1% more frequently in subsequent titles and abstracts than ideas generated by mostly female teams over a period of 5 years after they were first published. We find that women's ideas are less adopted, says Cheng, in part because women are not as well connected in networks as men, at least when it comes to short-range connections. The analysis shows that ideas are more likely to be adopted when the potential adopter is close to the innovator, so if women have fewer short-range connections, says Cheng, that could be bringing down the total adoption rate for their ideas. Even when smaller networks are corrected for, she says, women's ideas were less likely to be adopted, even by other women. For closer members of their networks, women were more likely to adopt ideas from women than from men, but as the distance from the innovator increased, women were actually less likely to adopt new ideas from other women than they were from men. So when we just increase the proportion of female researchers in biomedical research, it does not actually increase the overall adoption rates for an idea from a female innovator, says Cheng. Their analysis also shows that Black and Hispanic innovators have fewer close-range network connections than white and Asian innovators, and that ideas with a substantial number of Black or Hispanic authors were less likely than average to be mentioned by researchers more than one step away. Ideas F. Despite early career researchers having fewer network connections, their ideas were more likely to be adopted than mid- or late-career researchers. We think about researchers as frequently focusing on conditions that are relevant for their groups, he says. Thus, the identity of the innovator and the nature of the idea could have substantial effects on what kinds of medical conditions get attention. Women's health conditions are more studied by female researchers, says Cheng. So when the research conducted by female scientists is getting less attention, that might lead to some disparity in terms of female and male health conditions. Some limitations. The authors note a few caveats to their study. He adds that the algorithms they used weren't set up to account for gender fluidity and only included a handful of racial and ethnic categories. According to University of Colorado Boulder statistician Aaron Clossett, who was not involved in the study, it's hard to really know why someone chooses to adopt one idea over another without directly asking them in an interview, but since that approach wouldn't be feasible at the scale used in the P. Being able to quantify the flow of ideas at the scale of the new analysis is just plain difficult. Even though we can't directly see the full picture of bias in idea adoption, He says we can see the shadows it casts in the data the researchers gathered. The more shadows you can put together, the better reconstruction you can get at the phenomenon, says Closet. To explore more of these shadows, and their impact on idea diffusion, Closet suggests analyzing other forms of social networks in scientific communities, such as who went to graduate school together or who acknowledges whom at the end of their papers. Quantitative researcher Matthijs de Vaan of University of California, Berkeley, says he'd like to see validation of the new ideas the analysis extracted via natural language processing. Sometimes, he says, it can be difficult even for him to unpack the novelty of a paper just by reading the abstract, let alone a machine that doesn't have the knowledge I have as a researcher. But if validated, he says the concept of using a machine to identify new ideas from scientific abstracts. These could include institutions reshuffling research teams to have more race or gender balance, as well as promoting more diverse teams, says Gilbolt, such as by awarding them grants or helping researchers from underrepresented groups make connections at meetings. I guess the self-help tip is to be aware of your implicit biases, says Weinberg, especially when reviewing proposals, papers, or CVs. As scientists, he says, our stock in trade is being at the frontier of knowledge. And challenging one's biases when a great idea is on the line, is a way of getting closer and staying closer to the frontier of knowledge. Quote, please support my channel to grow by pressing subscribe button and the bell icon. We will notify you technological news. Thank you.